Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Big rumours emerging on the Mercedes W15 that Lewis Hamilton's primary complaint at the start of last season is being resolved for the new Mercedes Challenger for the upcoming season. Hamilton was furious with the team back in March and April for not listening to his suggestions on the cockpit positioning and the lack of confidence that caused him to have in the potential performance of the car. This situation is apparently going to be resolved for the upcoming season and could be key to Mercedes and Hamilton having the confidence to push the car to the limit, which is likely going to be necessary to take down Red Bull and Max Verstappen. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, a pretty crazy piece of news yesterday from Jenson Button, who we know that he raced at Le Mans last year in that, was it like the Chevy, NASCAR car basically they put together to drive. It was actually very exciting. But this year he's going to be doing it for real in a way in the hypercar. So he's signed with Jota to drive this beautiful Porsche next year's Le Mans. Pretty sure Jota also briefly led this year's Le Mans, didn't they? So yeah, they're an entry into next year's hypercar series and for the World Endurance Championship, and Button is going to be doing that, which is, I think he's 44 now. We're talking 15 years pretty much after he won his Formula 1 World Championship and many years after he officially retired from the sport. He's back in racing, and he came up with an explanation to say that, well, the wife's given me permission, like I'm just a better person when I'm racing. This is the thing, you can't stop these guys being massively competitive. They always want to race to some degree. I will say though, in the BBC article about this, they talked about other drivers. We're talking Grosjean, who's driving for the Lamborghini guys, Danny Kvyat, of course, other former drivers. Mick Schumacher, we know, is going to drive for Alpine in the World Endurance Championship next season as well. We've got Fernando Alonso, who's done this stuff before. But also have a look at this. Several big-name drivers have been linked with a return to sports cars, including four-time Formula 1 champion Sebastian Vettel, who could race for Aston Martin in 2025 after competing for them in F1 at the end of the year, at the end of his career. So that's really interesting because I don't think the BBC would say this if they didn't have some confidence that it's possibly true. So, and what do you guys think about that? The Aston Martin Valkyrie, right? That project, the potential hypercar situation. I mean, it's an absolutely stunning machine. And the idea that Vettel could, it also kind of makes sense because it was like that Valkyrie Newey designs, Vettel, the relationship with Newey and the Red Bull thing, and then obviously driven at Aston Martin. It does kind of make sense. So maybe stay tuned for that one, right? The Button could come back this year, and then, of course, significantly older than Vettel, and then maybe Vettel could come back next year. Who knows? Definitely not entirely impossible. I'll also mention this from Chris Medland. We know that there's been lots of drama over the last couple of weeks between especially Toto Wolff, Susie Wolff, and the FIA. The investigation, the backlash, the potential lawsuit about it as well. And Chris Medland says this is not done just yet, right? Just because the FIA said, oh yeah, sorry guys, we're going to rescind the investigation, and just because Toto Wolff then came out and said, well, it doesn't really bother me, but what bothers me is that they come after my family and all this stuff. It's not done yet, you know what I mean? Mercedes have talked about that they're not going to make a proper statement until they talk to the lawyers on this. Whether they can sue for defamation or reputation damage or whatever you want to say is probably quite plausible. And we know that the intention of the F1 teams making all those statements seem to be to try and win this power struggle against the FIA or to try and get Mohammed Ben Sulayem out of his job. So Chris Medland says that he heard a phrase that somebody said that after a quiet season, it will be a loud winter, i.e. there's going to be lots of drama here going down between the FIA and relevant Formula 1 teams and maybe Formula 1 management themselves. And that's a big one to stay tuned for. And also Formula 1 themselves, or the FIA themselves, have commented on this. Because recently there was some discussion, I think, from Jean Todt, the former president, that maybe the FIA, they're constantly saying, oh, we don't have the money for this, don't have the money for that. And the general perception was like, well, you sure, lads? Like, I think you're doing all right in terms of cash in the bank type thing. But the FIA said, no, it's unsustainable. We can't afford this, so we need more money in this way, that way, and the other way. And some people are convinced by that, some people are not so convinced by that, but the FIA keeps saying that they're in an unsustainable position, and Mohammed Ben Sulayem's been fighting this whole thing, but the more that he tends to fight internally with people in Formula 1, the more that he becomes at risk of getting ousted, which I still don't think would be a massively surprising thing. But speaking of Toto Wolff, he also came up with this statement yesterday that as far as he's concerned, Lewis Hamilton is still the best driver in the world. He's not going to say anything else, is he? Let's be honest. Most team principals of a driver that's won all the championships would say the exact same thing. Look, this season did Verstappen perform at a ridiculously high level? Is Hamilton in his prime now? Like maybe, 2018 Hamilton, something like that, was an absolute monster. But to be fair, end of 2021, Hamilton was also an absolute monster. And, I think he's still got the ability there. We just haven't necessarily seen it all the time. There's been flourishes. The race pace has still been good. Qualifying hasn't been as good the last couple of seasons. But to be honest, a large part of that I would say, is confidence in the car. I do still think that if Hamilton gets the car, especially at Mercedes, of the two drivers, he's definitely the far more likely to put up a serious challenge to Max Verstappen and Red Bull. And a lot of the kind of lacking maybe performance in qualifying from Hamilton, sure, he got the pole in Hungary, but apart from that, he's been, his race pace advantage over Russell is significantly greater than his qualifying pace over Russell. And we know that Russell's missed a Saturday and everything, but Hamilton is, the best qualifier in the history of the sport, 104 pole positions. It's a record that, Verstappen might get the win record in a few years' time, but I don't think he's going to get the pole position record. Like, that record from Hamilton is just absurd. But the lack of qualifying performance on a consistent basis from Hamilton is probably the thing that's really cost him race victories, you could argue, over the last couple of seasons, or at least consistent top performances. Let's say Singapore, if he outqualifies Russell, he quite possibly wins that race. He seemed to have more pace at the end of the race to maybe try and overtake Norris and Sainz than Russell did. And the only reason Russell was in front for the whole race is because Hamilton qualified further back. So this is the key concern that Hamilton has to deal with. And Hamilton said multiple times throughout the season that he needs to improve his qualifying. But as we've said before, a large part of that comes down to confidence in the car when it's at the absolute limit. And that's something that Hamilton couldn't really seem to find too much in this year's W14 because of the way it was designed in large part. So the W15 is going to be dramatically different in basically every single way. James Allison said they have a very ambitious program, what they're trying to achieve with the car. They believe they're taking a big step forward. The question is it a big enough step forward? But we know that in some parts, the car has a certain amount of performance in it, but also if the driver is confident taking it to the maximum, then you gain an extra couple of tenths. And I think even Hamilton said that when they brought the floor update to Austin and stuff, that it was only worth 1/10. But Hamilton felt that he gained at least another tenth and a bit just because he had a bit more confidence in the way the car was going to perform, and especially in qualifying when you're going max out, that actually makes a significant amount of difference. So it was a massive concern that Hamilton had at the start of the season was the cockpit positioning, and this interesting account here, Mercedes AMG TR, they came out with some rumours last season as well that were generally pretty on the money, but take all this stuff with a grain of salt. It's rumours, it's sources, it's kind of leaks behind the scenes on what the Mercedes guys are working on. But I'll go through it, and of course, it's translated, so this might not be perfect. But apparently James Allison is talking about that, it's the mechanical grip that's the most important part of these cars. Trying to look at the W15 on a holistic manner, so instead of looking at individual perspectives, looking at the entire package in terms of aero, both downforce and drag, ride, handling, suspension, setup. Red Bull's biggest advantage comes from this. Pretty funny in a way, like they mentioned basically every feature about the car, and they're like, yeah, Red Bull are pretty good at all these things. So, that's the issue that the other team have to deal with and the other teams have to resolve. But this is what he had to say on the design of the car, shall we say. So they go on to talk about the radiators, the coolers, the way that it's going to be packaged, especially with the zero side pod concept disappearing. But have a listen to this. So Mercedes is returning to the long axle design with the W15. It produces a vehicle design which is relatively short at the front and has maximum surface area to create the ground effect at the rear and the side pod area. However, the driver's seat position, which Hamilton wants so much to be further back, is going to be further back. Now, I'm not sure exactly on the translation of this. It will be positioned to the side. I imagine that it's still going to be like straight on the car rather than like a side car, right? But, we'll see, I guess. In this way, our pilots will be able to feel the rear of the vehicle more. This is the key thing that Hamilton said. We'll discuss that more in a second. There's a few other things as well on the radiators, the coolers, the way that they're going to be packaged more horizontally, which means that they can generate more performance in the power units because they can be mounted where they want to mount them rather than where they have to mount them if they want to do a zero side pod design. And it's just another one of these things that they thought the zero pod was going to be so rapid in the simulator that they made so many sacrifices to make that happen. And then it wasn't rapid. So all of a sudden, they had loads of sacrifices that were being made for effectively no reason. So he goes on to say, as I say, grain of salt and all this stuff, but the front edge of the base extends uncurled all the way to the side of the chassis. This not only includes a small notch for the rear, but is supported by a closely spaced inner fairing that is the same height and is cut before the end of the base. So, look, I'm not good enough at visualizing in my head what that's going to look like, but it's some nice, sexy, motorsport, engineering-related words. So, if you can figure it out in your mind, feel free. However, it will combine those coming out of the adjacent edge wing and form a vortex in this section. The team has tried to improve the airflow conditions at the edge of the tread and regulate the flow to the rear tyre. this is aimed to protect the rear tyres, which was, let's say, Brazil, an absolute shambles for the car. They brought the upgrade in Austin and it kind of worked. But at a circuit like Brazil, I mean, they got the setup wrong. They were just cooking their tyres. So that's one of the things they've got to try and maintain. With the changes to be made in the rear suspension and diffuser, an attempt was made to find a balance between downforce and reducing drag. So that's what we know about the car so far. That's what we believe we know about the car so far. But to me, it's this Hamilton cockpit position complaint that has now been apparently approved in a way by the team. This is what we're talking about, by the way. This was a big drama, really. We're talking, a couple of months into the season when obviously the W14 wasn't the car they wanted it to be. Of all the cars, these were the competitive cars at the time before the McLaren came onto the scene. The Red Bull has the furthest back cockpit position of anybody. Most other teams have the cockpit somewhat further forward. Ferrari as well has it quite far forward, but you can see Hamilton's helmet here. Like, there's a significant amount further forward there than when Verstappen is, and it's basically more than any other team as well. So I don't think there can be no correlation between what Red Bull are doing and what potentially other teams should be doing in terms of this cockpit position. Now, I think this was a factor of the design of the car. Again, to do the zero pods, they have to package things very tightly back here, which means they don't have the space to bring the cockpit position further back. It's, they don't necessarily want to have Hamilton and Russell sitting where he is, but it's a necessity of the way that they designed their car with various tricks of the regulations and certain fairings and things where they have to be. It meant that they had to have the cockpit further forward than they probably ideally liked. But if they package the car differently, if they ignore the zero pods and just run it back with a more traditional model, which they are now doing and they finally realize is a good idea, then they can solve a lot of these issues. They can solve a lot of the cooling issues that the engine sometimes had. Therefore, they can probably run it at higher power rates. They can solve the issues of their really bulky gearbox, which was making them very draggy on the straights, so they can be faster on the straights. And they can put Hamilton in a better cockpit position. So, all of those factors combined should give them a good few tenths. Now, could give them a second, but depends if Red Bull find a second with their new design. But this is back in March when Hamilton said, I've had many cars like this, particularly in the McLaren days. Hamilton's driven F1 cars of 15 plus years. He's driven a fair few cars that have good cockpit positions as far as he's concerned, or poor cockpit positions as far as he's concerned, further forward, further back, and all this stuff. And he knows from experience that he prefers the cars that have the cockpit position as far rearward as he can make it, necessarily. You're not going to go that far to the rear of the car because there is a massive engine back there. But he pretty much slammed his engineers back in March and said that, last year I had these issues with the car. It's about the team saying we didn't listen to you. And this was particularly on the cockpit position where he was frustrated with not having the feeling in the car. Hamilton's feeling was that because he's further forward, understanding what the rear of the car is doing and just feeling the way it's moving and sliding on the tarmac and all this stuff is more challenging the further forward you are. He prefers to be further rearward. Now, Russell didn't complain about this massively. He didn't seem to mind so much, but, they have different driving styles in some ways. Hamilton has a different feel for the car than Russell does. And also, if Mercedes are going to listen to one of their drivers, and one of their drivers is more likely to deliver a championship over the next couple of years, if Mercedes do deliver a competitive car, it is Hamilton over Russell. And also, Toto just said a couple of minutes ago that we saw that Hamilton's still the best driver on the planet. So, of course, if they're going to listen to one of their drivers, it's going to be to Lewis. And he said back in March, look, guys, you've got to solve this for me next year. I'm not happy about it. If you give me more confidence, I'll be in a position to do so. So Mercedes then said in April, all right, a 7-time world champion has an opinion. It's important to listen to it. And we agree. So apparently now they're executing on that. And Hamilton's cockpit position and Russell's cockpit position will be further rearwards, which should give the drivers, maybe Hamilton especially, more feeling and control and confidence on what the rear of the car is doing. That could be worth a good couple of tenths in performance alone, and it could be worth a good bit of advantage in qualifying as well. Because the amount of times this season where Hamilton was saying, look, I'd love to be faster, but I just can't send it into this corner knowing that the rear isn't going to step away from me. And if he is more confident in that, then it unlocks potential additional lap time as well. So definitely a big story from the Mercedes side, assuming they actually execute this. But, okay, these are leaks to be taken with a bit of a pinch of salt. But at the end of the day, it's pretty expected, right, that Mercedes will listen to Hamilton on this one and will try and get his thoughts over the line. But there's just a few things that Mercedes they've built cars that could, I mean, look, last year they won a race, this year they weren't too far away, but these cars had so many flaws in the fact that they were trying to package for a zero pod that simply didn't work at the ride heights. They had to make so many sacrifices for that, and now they can peel away some of those sacrifices. They're probably going to have a more competitive car underneath. Whether it's competitive enough, because Horner says, oh, the field is going to converge, don't worry guys, and but look, of course he said the same thing last year. I'm pretty sure you can find this exact article with Horner saying field will converge in 2023. And of course, we saw a rather different story on that one. Just to close out with, I thought this is interesting. We saw this yesterday and the day before really on, first half, second half of the season, what the teams were doing. Verstappen scored slightly more points in the second half than the first half, but Perez did quite significantly less, so that puts them at technically a better first half than the second half of the season, but not a bad year for Red Bull, all things considered. Mercedes actually went down not that far, especially because we've got McLaren making huge strides. It was mainly Aston Martin, right? They went from 184 to 96 from the first half to the second half of the season. And basically every other team capitalized on that. Like Ferrari got more points, McLaren got more points, Alpine as well had more points, especially in the hands of Gasly, even Williams, certainly AlphaTauri. So I think it was mainly the Aston Martin and, to be fair, the Perez downfall, which opens the door for many of these other teams to get more points. But even then, somehow Sauber, Stake F1, Kick Sauber, whatever team that we talked about yesterday, and Haas managed to go backwards. But very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.